Every summer, thousands of holidaymakers flock here to the British seaside to enjoy the warm weather, the pebble beaches and the amusement arcades. But there's another side to these shores, a sinister underbelly of violence and murder, where sins are washed away in the tide and where the seafront is stalked by sadistic killers who, like the ocean itself, have no respect for human life. My name's Dr. Nell Darby. I've written extensively about the history of crime, researching the reasons why people kill. Over the course of my career, I've developed a keen eye for spotting trends in a killer's behaviour. Nowhere are these trends more striking than in the not-so-sunny seaside towns of Britain's coastline, which have always seemed to attract an extraordinarily high number of murderous rogues. In this series of Murder by the Sea, I examine a selection of chilling new cases, many of which have never been featured on television before. Join me on a journey to the cliff's edge, where the land meets the sea, and where life meets death. On Murder by the Sea today, we're going back to 1920s Eastbourne. When Patrick Mahon killed and dismembered his lover, Emily, here, he could never have imagined that the person to expose his crime would be none other than his formerly loyal wife.
The Crumbles is a long stretch of pebbly beach between Pevensey Bay and Eastbourne itself. Now, Eastbourne has for centuries been one of England's most favourite but genteel seaside resorts.
Eastbourne was very much a favoured resort on the south coast, on what people call the English Riviera. It was very popular with people coming down from London, and in fact it went from just a few years from being a small fishing village to an important international resort by the 1920s. There were lots of hotels and lots of people came down not only to stay for the week but day trippers coming down from London. Eastbourne is probably much bigger than it was in the 1920s. In fact, the Crumbles, where this incident happened, is now housing. But previously, Eastbourne was a relatively small town, but it was surrounded by the Downs on one side and then the long shingle beaches on the other. I think Eastbourne thought it was rather superior to the other resorts. For instance, when you go to Eastbourne, there are no shops, there are no cafes along the seafront. Also, all of the buildings along the seafront are painted white as well. They're quite select.
From its inception, Eastbourne cultivated a reputation for a more genteel, cultured holiday experience, much less in your face than a lot of the resorts further down the coast. Despite this, the small stretch of pebbly beach known as the Crumbles was in the 1920s the scene for not one but two separate murders which captivated the nation and disturbed beyond measure the quiet, genteel seaside resort of Eastbourne.
My name's Kevin Gordon. I'm a retired British Transport Police officer. I live in Eastbourne, where I'm a local historian. And I just love looking into Eastbourne in the past and finding out about the people that not only lived in the town that came down here for their holidays. I just enjoy finding the stories of these people and what it was like 100 years ago. People have found out about crime stories around the world from the newspapers, not just in the area, but all over the country. And in fact, the murders that happened in Eastbourne appeared in newspapers across the globe.
True crime has always fascinated people, you know, from as early as the papers have existed. And certainly in Victorian times, you had huge crowds of ladies attending murder trials. And this was commented on, that how come ladies are supposed to be so delicate, and yet they're the ones who are particularly obsessed by true crime and want to go and watch all these trials and hear the gory details. And so this carries on, and you have quite a few kind of famous cases from the 1920s and 1930s that kind of really gripped the public imagination, and people wanted to go and watch these trials. They wanted to read about them.
Eastbourne had its fair share of murders. In 1912, a police inspector, Arthur Walls, was shot dead as he tried to arrest a burglar. And in 1920, Irene Munro was killed as she walked along the beach at the Crumbles.
She was walking one day on the Crumbles, on the pebbly beach, when she met two local men, Jack Field and William Gray. They fell to talking for about an hour when suddenly Field and Gray attacked her with a walking stick and a heavy rock. They beat her to death, stole her bag, pulled a gold ring from her finger, and then dug a shallow grave in the beach and buried her body. Within 24 hours, a local boy stumbled across Irene Munro's foot sticking out of the pebbles. Field and Gray were quickly arrested, charged, quickly convicted, and hanged at Wandsworth Prison for the murder of Irene Munro. And that was the first of the Crumbles murders. In stark contrast, the second Crumbles murder was a gory and baroque tale involving a serial thief, con man, womanizer, the brutal murder of a young pregnant woman, the gory dismemberment of her body, and a police hunt that stretched from the south coast to London and back again. It was, and remains, an example of what you might call the classic English seaside murder of the period. And at the time, it was a sensation. Readers devoured all the grisly, macabre details of this extraordinary case in newspapers day after day as they enjoyed their morning breakfasts.
The victim in this murder was Emily Kaye, a 27-year-old typist who lived alone in the West End of London.
Emily's interesting because she'd worked from a young age. She was very career-minded, very independent. I think she had originally worked as a confectioner. Her mother had worked as a confectioner with all the daughters working for her. She was then working as a typist and sharing lodgings with her sister in Manchester, where she was from, before moving to London. She'd amassed savings, she was very independent, but she was in her late 30s and unmarried and looking for a partner.
She was a modern, independent woman of the period. She was athletic, she enjoyed sports, she lived on her own in furnished rooms in the heart of the West End of London, and never profligate, she had saved up £500. Now that's equivalent to more than £24,000 today. But she was single, moderately well off, and those two elements would combine to lead her to her death.
Although women were becoming more independent, and women have always worked, you know, unless they were wealthy enough not to, the expectation was always that women wanted to settle down, get married, have children. That was their kind of role in life. So to get to your late 30s and still be unmarried, there was still an element of kind of shame attached to that, you know, the expectation that you were doing something abnormal by staying single. And we have to remember as well that whatever popular history would have you imagine, people did have sex out of marriage. You know, you could be unmarried and still have a sexual relationship, and lots of people did, and Emily wasn't alone in that.
In August 1923, a smart, dapper salesman walked into Emily's office. He introduced himself as Derek Patterson. He said he was 33, the sales manager, in reality a travelling salesman, for a firm in Sunbury-on-Thames, a little way outside London, and he said he had regular business with Emily's employers. Some of this story was true. The man was a sales representative, sales manager, and the company name he gave, Consul's Automatic Aerators Limited, was genuine. He did genuinely work for that. He didn't quite bring himself to mention that he only got the job on the strength of a recommendation of his wife, who also worked there, and he certainly didn't let on the truth about his life, because his name wasn't Derek Patterson. His real name was Patrick Mahon. That's spelt Mahon, but he came from Irish stock and it's pronounced Mahon.
He was born Herbert Mahon in 1889 in Liverpool. He came from an Irish family. He was quite well educated. In fact, he wanted to go into the church when he left school. However, he got involved in a number of petty crimes, and also he got married very quickly without permission of his parents, which rather shocked them. Mahon's wife was called Jessie, or also known as Marveline, and she obviously loved her husband. She stayed with him through thick and thin.
But Patrick Mahon had two interlinked weaknesses: sex and money.
Patrick Mahon had a kind of checkered past and a history of various types of offending. He was a thief, he'd stolen money from employers, he'd also committed an assault on another woman, attacking her with a hammer. He also wasn't very good in relationships, so he'd married young. He was about 20, I think, when he married, and had regularly had affairs. So he's a bit of a dodgy character. He's not trustworthy. He will do what he wants to get what he wants, whether that's gaining money or having affairs. He doesn't care.
Mahon thought he had what was known as the gift of the gab, that he could talk to anyone and talk his way out of any situation. He was good looking, he was athletic, and everybody seemed to like him.
So this is clearly a man who wasn't completely content with married life, despite being a father of two as well. He seems to be constantly looking out for the next opportunity to have an affair. So he clearly fancied himself a bit, was quite successful with women, and had no intention really of sticking to relationships for very long. However, he stayed with his wife. She would take him back regularly. And I think there's a difference between having affairs and then having relationships where the woman wanted to turn into something more, because his loyalty as it was always with his wife, so he didn't want to do anything that would kind of jeopardise the marriage.
The antecedents for an individual are one of the first things that get looked at. An analyst or researcher on a major crime investigation team will be searching the police national computer to see if anybody has got a history of violence, or if there's other offences which are similar to the one that the suspect is being arrested for. He had a particularly interesting background. There was convictions for deception and theft and fraud, and also a potential propensity for violence.
In 1911, he stole £123 from his employers. That's equivalent to £12,000 today. And he used the money to set off on a jaunt to the Isle of Man with a mistress. And he spent the time and the money there, enjoying the high life and her sexual favours, before returning home to Jessie. Remarkably, with the crime discovered, he was given only a caution for the theft, and Jessie, equally remarkably, took him back in. It would not be the last time that judicial leniency and matrimonial forgiveness played a role in Patrick Maughan's crimes.
His wife, she would not really wanted to have become divorced at that stage. There was a lot of stigma around anyone who got divorced, and particularly for the woman in that situation. So she would have probably stayed with him in the knowledge that although he was, potentially quite an aggressive, violent man, the options for her were quite limited, and she had to weigh up the odds of what that would mean for her if she did divorce him.
Patrick and Jessie moved to Wiltshire. He got a job in a local dairy farm. Here, he promptly stole another £60. That's around £6,000 more in today's money. He was caught, charged, and sent to prison for 1 year. When he got out, Jessie took him back again.
Maughan was certainly a philanderer. He had affairs with several women, including 2 or 3 that actually worked with his wife at the same company. He had an affair with one woman. He told her that his marriage had broken down, that he didn't like his wife and his wife didn't like him anymore. And he started an affair with him, but things started to change and get a bit dark. First of all, she noticed that little things were going missing from the house, including a cheque. And on one occasion, when he accused her of taking things, he hit her around the head with a stick. Needless to say, she broke off the romance immediately.
Fast forward to 1916. The world is at war. Patrick Maughan was committing more crimes. In 1916, he broke into the house, a respectable middle-class house in Chertsey, a quiet Surrey village then, to steal its contents. He was disturbed by the maid. He bludgeoned her about the head, trying to kill her. As she lay dying, as he thought, his only response to this was to ask her where her employers kept the keys to the safe. Hardly the actions of a man remorseful about what he had just done.
There are several red flags, so a history of violence, theft and dishonesty. Of particular interest would have been the incident where he broke into a house and was disturbed by one of the housemaids, who he then proceeded to attack with a hammer. So this suggests that he will go to extreme lengths to cover up any crimes that he's committed.
For that, he was sentenced to 5 years imprisonment at Dartmoor. And in fact, that was probably what saved his life, because everybody else, every man of that age at that time, was being recruited into the army. But rather than joining the army, he was in prison.
He's quite a violent individual. He's learnt that he can use quite extreme violence to get his own way and to achieve his ends. And as time goes on, it's very often seen in the backgrounds of these people that they will escalate this violence further and further, because they learn very quickly that they get what they want, and they can do that quite quickly and easily by resorting to quite serious aggressive behaviour.
In the end, Patrick Maughan served only 3 of those years. When he got out, once again, he went back to and was taken in by his long-suffering wife, Jessie.
Whilst Marn was in prison, his wife bought a house in Pagoda Avenue in Richmond. They had 2 children. When he came out of prison, he went to live with her in Richmond. By this time, he changed his name from Herbert Marn to Patrick Marn. He was very well liked in the local area. In fact, he was even involved in the local bowls club as well. But his wife was quite dowdy, and people noticed that whereas he was always dressed smartly, his wife never seemed to have any new clothes. Mrs. Marn, Marveline, had got a job with an aerating company. They put the bubbles into bread and into mineral water. That was based at Sunbury-on-Thames, not too far away. When her husband came out of prison, she got him a job at the company as a salesman. And he was probably a very good salesman. He, as I said, he could talk to anybody. He was seemed to be well educated, well dressed, and he was probably ideal for the job. Another girl working for the aerating company in Sunbury-on-Thames was Emily Beilby Kaye. She'd worked during the First World War as an ambulance girl, and she lived in central London at the Green Cross Club in Guildford Street. Emily and Patrick started a passionate affair. He again told her that his marriage was a sham, that his wife didn't like him, and he promised to take her away for a new life abroad. The affair happened in various places, including hotels on the south coast. He bought an engagement ring. Probably he used the money that he'd stolen from her own savings to buy her engagement ring.
She had got pregnant by him, which obviously put a bit more pressure on her to legitimise their forthcoming child by getting married to him beforehand. She claimed that he had proposed to her and that they were going to go and get married and emigrate to South Africa and start a life there. And I imagine that he suddenly felt under a lot of pressure because he had no intention to leave his wife. He was happy with the status quo there, and he didn't expect Emily to be putting this pressure on him. So suddenly all his playing around and having these fun relationships with other women, this is suddenly all becoming a bit serious.
On the 4th of April 1924, an advert appeared in the Daily Telegraph for a house down on the Crumbles in Eastbourne. It was a holiday let, and Marn went along to to see the estate agent in London, in Victoria Street, and he booked the officer's cottage down on the Crumbles for several weeks. When Marn booked the holiday let, he used a false name. He used the name Mr. Waller. And this was to be important later on in the case because he was to tell the court that he was going to take his wife down there on holiday.
What he said to Emily Kaye was, "This is a love experiment." That was the phrase he used. He said, "I have rented a house near Eastbourne on the Crumbles beach, and we will go there and we will spend the month together, seeing how we get along, seeing whether this test relationship will blossom into a full marriage." A bigamous marriage, of course, because he was still married to Jessie, and that's what he did.
So when we see people who are bigamists or have several sort of relationships on the go, they often see that as quite a challenging, exciting endeavour. And they are, if you imagine, spreading their resources quite widely and trying to keep up a number of different relationships. Also, it's something that they perhaps are trying to avoid getting into any kind of deep relationships, and they often, even people have been known to have affairs on their wedding days, and it's because they want to be able to seem to be one step ahead of other people, their partners. They don't want to commit, and they don't want to show that they've got this connection with that person, and really probably at the back of their minds is they're trying not to get themselves hurt, and it really speaks volumes as to how they are able to manipulate people and how people see them as individuals.
On the 7th of April, Emily changed all of her savings into French francs. She clearly thought that she was going to go over to France. However, he booked her into a hotel into Eastbourne. On the 12th of April, Emily moved into the holiday cottage on the Crumbles. On the very same day, Patrick Mahon went to a kitchen equipment company in Victoria Street. He bought a large knife and a tenon saw known as a bone saw. It probably went a bit too far for Mahon. I think most of his lovers, he had affairs with them maybe for a few weeks or a few months, and then he ended it to move on. However, Emily was far more serious. It had gone too far for him, and maybe the crux of it is when she had told him that she was pregnant. He knew that something had to happen, and in his eyes, the only thing that could happen was her death.
At some point on April the 15th, Mahon claims to have picked up a coal scuttle and hit Emily on the head with it, killing her.
He claimed it was after an argument and that she was attacking him, and he'd kind of either attacked her in self-defense or she'd fallen over and hit her head on a coal scuttle. You know, and while it's clear that we're never going to know for sure what happened, it seems likely, given the injuries that they later found on her body, that he had attacked her and murdered her.
Patrick Mahon's brutal attack on the pregnant Emily Kaye was horrific in itself. But what he did next to cover up the murder took the crime to a whole new sordid level.
Mahon would later claim that he hadn't attacked Emily. In fact, the reverse, he said, was true. She had thrown an axe at him which had narrowly missed his head and buried itself in the woodwork of the door jamb behind him. Mahon's account was fatally undermined by what he did in the aftermath of killing Emily. Over the next 3 days, Mahon systematically dismembered Emily's body.
It's a weird thing to say, but it's easy enough to kill. The hard bit is what happens afterwards, what you do. So few people seem to actually think, oh my God, I've killed someone, I'd better call the police. Or, you know, alert the authorities and, you know, or get help for this person, you know, call an ambulance. Are they really dead? Instead, there's suddenly this panicked reaction of, oh my God, what do I do now? And little thought goes into an organised response.
He used the tenon saw and he used the knives, the butcher's knives that he bought in London to cut up her body. At one stage, he told the police that he cut off her head and put it on the fire in order to burn. He said this happened late on in the evening, and as he watched the flames flicker around the head of his poor victim, he said that her eyes opened and stared at him. He was so scared he ran out of the building and slept for the whole night on the shingle outside the house, even though it was pouring down with rain at the time. He said that when he returned to the fire the next day, all of the evidence had gone and burnt to ashes.
So in this particular case, although we might not necessarily know how she died, we do know that there were attempts to dismember the body and destroy her remains. Some body parts were found in a fireplace, and we know that we need extreme heat to remove and destroy body tissue and bone. Certainly in terms of a cremation, then the temperatures that need to be achieved are extremely high. The whole facility of a cremation is that it's designed to achieve those temperatures in a closed situation. So if you place a body part on an open fire, then it's very difficult to achieve the same temperatures. And in many cases where fire has been used to try and destroy body parts, it's often the case that small remnants of bone and material will survive because the heat hasn't been sufficient to totally cremate those remains.
He burnt her head, legs and feet in the fireplace, and he took the resulting charred fragments, crushed them up and dumped them over the back garden wall. He wrapped packages of Emily's remains up, ready for the next stage of his plan.
There's kind of this panicked reaction and this attempt to dismember her and dispose of the body parts, but it's done very, very badly. Then at one stage, he's on a train throwing bits of her body out of a window. So there's really kind of like this very disorganised attempt to hide the evidence of what he's done.
His plan was to dump as many of the bags as he could out of the train window as it chugged up from Eastbourne to London. By the time he arrived in Waterloo, though, he had one bag remaining. It was a leather Gladstone bag, and inside it had blood-stained clothing and the murder weapons.
He puts his murder weapon, and bloody clothing in a bag and hides it, thinking it won't be found again. And the fact that there's so many body parts in various locations, both around the cottage and outside it, he's actually increasing the chance of Emily being found, or part of her being found, because there's so many bits everywhere.
He decided he would lodge the bag at the left luggage office at Waterloo Station, and he paid 5p, got a ticket which allowed him to leave it there for several days.
Amazingly, when he got to the railway station at Richmond, he met a girl that didn't have an umbrella. He offered to walk her home under the umbrella, and in the short distance to her home, he managed to get her details and arrange for a date. He was to take this young girl down to the holiday cottage. She noticed that there were women's things around. He just said that they were things that were left by his wife, again giving the same old story that his wife didn't understand him. Meanwhile, his wife was getting worried about her husband. Why was he spending all this time away? She decided to go through some of his suits, and in the jacket or pocket of one of the suits, she found a ticket stub for Waterloo railway station.
The interesting thing about this story to me is the role of Jessie, Patrick's wife, who for so long has tolerated all his affairs or taken him back after affairs. And yet now she becomes suspicious that he's having yet another affair, or possibly gambling, neither of which she approves of. But she needs to try and find more information to find out whether her hunches are right.
Now, just up the road was a railway policeman. His name was John Beard, and she spoke to him and asked if he could find out what her husband had left in the left luggage office at Waterloo.
There's always been a bit of competition between police and private detectives, and they were seen very differently, and it kind of harks back to Jack the Ripper, really, where the police were seen as not being able to catch the killer, and there was a lot of speculation in the press that, well, if you got private detectives involved, they'd probably be able to find the killer, because the police were seen as very dull, very ordinary, whereas private detectives were a bit more kind of maverick and might break the law or try and do things in a different way and get results. Obviously, it's complicated by the fact that so many policemen then turned private detective, so they were working kind of in parallel. But private detectives could get results because they weren't bound by the same rules that the police were.
The two of them went up to the railway station, and the policeman went in to find out what was in the bag. It was a brown Gladstone bag, and when he forced it open, Beard found that it contained blood-stained women's underclothing, disinfectant, and 2 large knives.
They then went together to report Patrick Mahon to Scotland Yard.
So back when this murder took place, it would have been down to good old-fashioned detective work. So that is literally feet on the ground, going around, knocking on doors, speaking to police forces, police officers speaking to one another to see what the background of any suspects and victims would be. But it would have been a very, very long process, a laborious process, bringing that investigation into the modern age. There's a lot more access to digital information, so investigations progress at a far faster rate than they would have done.
Scotland Yard sent its detectives. They turned up at the left luggage office, saw the bag, examined its contents, but decided what they needed to do was to put it back into storage and then to lie in wait for Mahon when he came back to claim it.
A small fragment was cut from one of the pieces of blood-stained underclothing, and it was sent away for having a blood test. That blood test found that it was human blood. The police decided to keep an eye on the left luggage office, and when Mahon went to retrieve his Gladstone bag, he was arrested.
So at the time of this case, then we would almost certainly have been using what we call A-B-O blood grouping, which is your blood type essentially. But of course it's not as discriminating as the technology of DNA that we have available to us today.
If Jessie and John Beard hadn't found that holdall, the police would have had a harder job, and Patrick would have had longer to try and clear some of the evidence. She actually got justice for her husband's lover. Having caught Patrick Mahon with a bag of blood-stained undergarments and the murder weapons, the police took him back to Scotland Yard for questioning.
In the interview room, DCI Savage opened up the bag and put on the interview table the blood-stained contents of the bag. He asked Mahon to account for these items. Mahon appeared to be quite nonchalant about it. He said that he just used the bag for carrying meat for his dog and that he cut up the meat with the knives. Savage told Mahon that he knew the blood was human and said that his story did not work. And then something remarkable happened. Nothing. Savage did not say a word to Mahon. He just sat there and looked at him. And this was for 3/4 of an hour. In the end, Mahon broke and he said to the police officer, "I expect you know all about it." Well, the fact is that the police knew nothing at all. All they had was blood-stained underwear. They didn't have a body, they didn't have a report of a missing person, they didn't know who had been murdered, and they didn't know where the murder was. Again, another 15 minutes went by, and eventually Mahon said, "OK, I'll tell you the story." He then told the Chief Inspector his event of how Emily Kaye was murdered down on the beach at Eastbourne. He said Emily had picked up an axe and thrown it at him. It had glanced off of his shoulder. He said that he got mad and pushed her backwards. He said that Emily fell backwards and hit her head on a coal scuttle, and then she became unconscious. He said that her skull was cracked and that she died soon afterwards.
The detectives charged him with murder, and he was sent for trial for having killed with malice aforethought Emily Kaye, his lover.
The Chief Inspector grabbed hold of a police scenes of crime officer. He was a police photographer then, a man called William McBride, and they both travelled at speed from London down to Eastbourne. They went to the police station at Eastbourne and were taken along to the holiday cottage, to the officer's cottage on the Crumbles. They entered the house with a key that was found in Mahon's pocket, and they searched, and what they found surprised and shocked them.
Certainly by the time of this case, then we had a good understanding of forensic science and the power that it could bring to investigation. Edmond Locard was around in France. He was demonstrating that physical evidence could be transferred between individuals and could be a really powerful tool in the investigation of crime. So almost certainly, although the techniques and the processes wouldn't have been advanced as they are today, they would have had forensic science in their tool belt and have used it to link people and spaces with activities.
Mahon had said Emily had died when she fell backwards and her head had split open when it hit a coal scuttle. And the coal scuttle was recovered, and it was a cheap tin and brass coal scuttle, probably only worth a few shillings. So Bernard Spilsbury, along with the police, in order to disprove Mahon's story, even though they didn't have the head, bought a number of similar coal scuttles. They bought a number of sheep's heads. They bashed the coal scuttles against and the sheep's heads together to see what damage would have been caused in order to crack open the skull. They found that in order to break open the skull, the coal scuttle would be a mangled wreck with hardly anything left. However, what was found at the murder scene, the coal scuttle just had a couple of small dents.
To document the crime scene, the police had taken a photographer with them. This would prove to be a pioneering use of crime scene photography, something that would go on to be a permanent feature in murder investigations.
I was a British Transport police officer and used to travel all over the country. And many years ago, I was at York doing some training with the British Transport Police at York, and there was a local postcard fair. I bought a number of postcards and took them back to the Railway Police Office, where I spoke to somebody called Colin Sinclair, the local sergeant. When I showed him the pictures, they included a picture of the holiday cottage where the murder happened. And much to my surprise, Colin knew about the murder. So I asked him, how does a policeman in Yorkshire know about a murder in Eastbourne? And he told me that his grandfather was Superintendent Sinclair of the East Sussex Police. It was him that had brought Marn from London down to Sussex, and it was him that was in care of the murderer whilst he was awaiting trial. And Colin said to me, and I've got the scenes of crime photographs off in my loft if you want them. And that's how I came with a genuine original set of scenes of crime photographs. There were 6 photographs taken. The first one is a general scene of the holiday cottage. The quality was superb. They were sharp and they were clear, and they covered the aspects of the crime. For instance, one of the pictures shows the coal scuttle that Marn had used in his defence to say that she'd hit her head on. That was photographed as well. Within 24 hours, Professor Bernard Spilsbury, the acclaimed pathologist, was down at Eastbourne conducting a post-mortem on the remains that were found. A huge search was done with the police digging up the garden, looking at various places around the scene in order to find clues. Bernard Spilsbury, the pathologist, tried to sort of almost put the body back together again and found that there were a number of parts that were missing. For instance, her head was missing completely, and that was an important part of the case because that is what Marn had said was the fact that killed her. So the very part of the body that was involved in what he said was the reason for her dying was missing. Also, her womb was missing, as she was pregnant at the time, and obviously Marn wanted to completely destroy that evidence.
His trial that July was a sensation. This is the high point almost of the British newspaper industry.
Journalists came down from London. They hired the hotel opposite the courtroom so that they could try to get photographs inside the court when the trial was happening. Marn thought that he could impress the jurors. He particularly wanted to impress the ladies on the jury, and that really backfired because the case was so distraught for people that the judge had decided only men should appear on the jury. When he appeared in court, he was very well dressed and he was suntanned. And you might be wondering, how could he be suntanned when he's been in a police cell for the last 6 months? Well, the fact is that whilst he was being held, he chewed tobacco in his cell and he spread the juice from the tobacco over his arms and face to make it appear that he was suntanned. Marn was clearly guilty, and there were a number of things that the court were told about. He booked the holiday cottage in a false name, even though he said he was going to take his family down there. There was also the fact that he bought the knives at least 2 days prior to the date that he said that he'd killed her, and that was obviously a shocking piece of evidence. He'd stolen the victim's money. There was evidence that he was using money from a bank account.
At the end of the trial, it took the jury just 45 minutes to convict Patrick Marn of murder.
The jury very soon found him guilty. The judge, Justice Avery, put a black cap on and sentenced him to death.
Marn was basically only preoccupied with himself. That's all that mattered. He was out for whatever enjoyment he could get from life, and he didn't care who he hurt. And you get these cases where an individual is facing execution or they're on trial for their lives, but they still make that effort to dress up, to look good, because they know they're being watched by people. They've got that attention on them, and they like that attention.
Although we see quite often now that people write to serial killers in prison and there's sort of almost like a fan base, this is one of the first cases where this sort of behaviour happened. And we try to sort of understand what's going on in the minds of people who try to engage with people in prison in these kind of romantic relationships. And often people believe that they have some kind of connection, some kind of ability maybe to help these people, and they're very kind of keen to become involved in it. And the notoriety of these people also allows them some kind of infamy, and they very much enjoy it.
2 months later, after a rejected appeal and an equally fruitless hunger strike, Patrick Mahon was led to the gallows in Wandsworth Prison in London.
Mahon was executed at Wandsworth Prison on the 3rd of September 1924. He was executed by Britain's executioner Albert Pierpoint, and Bernard Spilsbury was there to witness his execution and do the subsequent post-mortem. Spilsbury said that Mahon had been executed twice because when Pierpoint pulled the lever for him to drop down to be executed, Mahon tried to jump clear and therefore broke his neck twice.
It was exactly 3 years and 7 months since William Gray and Jack Field had been executed on that very same scaffold for the first murder on the Crumbles at Eastbourne. The murder of Emily Kaye had one positive outcome, and one which would greatly improve the detection and processing of murder cases from 1924 onwards.
When Spilsbury, the pathologist, had gone along to the scene of crime, he thought it was not correct that the police officers were handling pieces of flesh with their bare hands. So when he went back to Scotland Yard, he arranged with the police to set up something called a murder bag. And that murder bag had tools and gloves and everything the police needed when they attended the initial scene of a murder.
Scotland Yard adopted the murder bag that same year, and it would be rolled out by force after force across the country in the years after. If nothing else, the murder of Emily Kaye led to that advance in policing.
It was Jessie Mahon who, with the help of police, caught her husband. Although she may not have intended to show sister loyalty towards Emily Kaye, it was her actions that ensured her husband's lover would get justice.